The Cottage with Crimson Curtains, a Miss Marple story section. 1. A curtain drawn on wood was the sort of village that looked as though it had stepped directly out of a watercolor soft greens, sloping thatched roofs, and a single winding lane that threaded its way past hedgerows and cottages with names like Thimblewick and Rose Haven. On a map, Elmswood was barely a pinprick, nestled quietly between Barchester and Lower Chisford, with no train station, only one telephone box, and a population that hadn't changed in more than a decade. Save for the occasional funeral dot, it was a village of routines. Morning post by 10, church bells on Sunday, the milkman's bicycle wheel squeaking at dawn. Life here was orderly, unremarkable, and proud of it, which made the arrival of Miss Vivian Stone 3 months prior all the more disruptive. She had taken the old Beecham cottage on Church Lane, the one with ivy-choked brickwork, and, most notably, crimson velvet curtains that remained drawn no matter the weather. Their appearance had become the subject of no small speculation among the Women's Institute. Crimson, Mrs. Maud Hemming had said over bridge, like something out of a cheap romance novel. Or a brothel, muttered Major Crispin, not looking up from his whiskey. Vivian Stone, in her mid-30s, well-spoken and fashionably aloof, had offered no explanations. She paid in advance. She hired no local help. She came and went at odd hours and received parcels, postmarked from London and Paris. She wore dark lipstick and silk gloves, and walked with the slow grace of someone who was used to being watched and knew how to endure it. Miss Marple had not, yet had occasion to speak with her, but she had observed her quietly and thoughtfully, as she did all new arrivals to Elmswood. There was nothing unladylike about Vivian, but there was something ... unresolved ... So it was a matter of mild astonishment when Mrs. Agatha French announced she had invited Miss Stone to the annual summer poetry afternoon. Genteel garden gathering not held since the death of her husband, Colonel French, 3 years prior. The gathering took place on a soft, golden afternoon in early July. Bees danced among lavender stalks. Rose petals drifted lazily on the breeze. The French estate, though slightly faded at the edges, had the proud proportions of a bygone era, its lawns well kept, its flower beds orderly, its hedges shaped like domes and fans. Garden chairs were arranged in semicircles on the grass, and bunting fluttered from trellises. Miss Marple arrived promptly at 3, guided through the gate by the vicar's wife, who appeared unusually flustered. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm so glad you came. We were all quite afraid the event might not come together." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, adjusting her gloves as she surveyed the setting, "it seems to have come together very prettily. Lemonade with real lemons, I see." The vicar's wife winced. "Yes, against my advice." Among the attendees were the usual cast of Elmswood's social set. Dr. George Sinner, bald as a billiard ball and fond of classical verse, had brought along his recently widowed sister Edith, who was already inspecting the garden's borders for signs of inadequate pruning. Thomas Elridge, the young schoolmaster, stood nervously near the lemonade table, his cuffs too short, his collar too tight, holding a book of Keats with the expression of someone about to be hanged. Mrs. Hemming, rotund and ever curious, circulated, like a ship on the tide, collecting snippets of gossip. and Major Crispin, with his pipe and mustard trousers, leaned moodily against the sundial, muttering about the degeneration of English verse. The hum of idle conversation halted briefly when Vivian Stone arrived. She made her way up the garden path with calm, deliberate steps, dressed in a perfectly fitted burgundy day dress and wide-brimmed straw hat, her gloves white and spotless. She greeted Agatha French with a smile that was both gracious and distant. When she removed her gloves, a narrow silver ring glinted on her left hand. "She's very polished," Mrs. Hemming whispered in Miss Marple's ear, watching Vivian settle into a front-row chair. "But terribly sad eyes, don't you think?" "I think," Miss Marple murmured, "she sees far more than she chooses to say." The poetry began. Young Thomas stumbled bravely through to autumn, his voice cracking slightly on Season of Mists. Mrs. French, wearing her customary pearls and powdered cheeks, recited an original composition entitled Reflections in a Rose Petal, which managed to be both vague and exceedingly long. Dr. Sumner, clearly enjoying himself, chose an excerpt from Houseman that ended in a rather abrupt mention of suicide, causing some unease among the older ladies. Vivian Stone did not read, nor did she excuse herself or fidget. She listened attentively, her gaze moving occasionally from reader to rose bush to the small black notebook she held in her lap, but never opened. Miss Marple, seated 3 rows back under the shade of a pear tree, observed her carefully. Vivian's face was smooth, composed, but her right hand, gloved in thin silk, remained tightly curled around the notebook, thumb tapping the edge in a slow, nervous rhythm. It was just as Agatha French rose again, this time to recite a piece titled Ode to Lavender, that the afternoon was interrupted. From beyond the eastern hedge came a sharp, jarring crack. It was the unmistakable sound of something fragile and expensive breaking. There was a brief pause, then a second noise, more muffled, less identifiable, a soft thump, like a sack falling onto gravel. The gathered guests looked up. Murmurs broke out. A few giggled nervously. "Oh, that will be the gardener," Agatha said quickly, flustered. "He's always knocking something over." Miss Marple, however, was already rising to her feet. Her eyes moved to the hedge specifically, to the narrow opening that led toward the back of the garden. Thomas Elridge and Dr. Simmer followed. They crossed through the opening and onto the stone path that curved behind the property just a few yards from the rear gate of Beecham Cottage. There, amidst a scattering of white porcelain shards, lay a broken cup, blue and white, the pattern Chinese. Beyond it, partially obscured by a tipped urn and collapsed trellis, was a man's body. He was slumped against the garden wall, his head tilted at a grotesque angle, mouth slightly open. His gray suit was rumpled, with grass stains along the knees. One shoe was missing. A dark stain bloomed near his temple. The skin beginning to swell, Dr. Sumner bent and touched the man's wrist, then looked up, grim. "He's dead." Thomas turned away, pale. Behind them, voices rose as the others approached. Mrs. French gasped. Edith Sumner screamed. Major Crispin cursed under his breath. But it was Vivian Stone who held everyone's attention. She had walked silently through the archway, her face unreadable. She looked down at the man's body, her gloved hand lifted very slightly to her lips, and then she spoke. "His name is Charles Denham." Her voice was calm, measured He was my husband." A shocked silence followed. Then, from somewhere in the garden, a bird gave a single, clear cry and flew off into the sky. Section 2. Whispered Theories in Brewing Teeby, Sunday morning. The village of Elmswood had become a hive of whispers. News of the body discovered behind the garden hedge, Charles Denham. The mysterious Mr. Stone had spread with astonishing speed. No one claimed to be the source, and yet nearly everyone claimed to have known something was amiss. At the post office, where Miss Beryl Twickenham arranged envelopes with the solemnity of a chapel organist, murmurs floated above the scent of ink and boiled sweets. "He was lying there like a crumpled doll," said Mrs. Maud Hemming in a dramatic stage whisper, "one leg all twisted under the other." "Dead before he hit the ground, I expect," replied Mr. Fothergill, the retired coal merchant who now considered himself an expert on cranial trauma, after reading 2 detective novels. "I heard," whispered Miss Daphne Clay, who had not been invited to the poetry afternoon and was still sore about it, "that he was poisoned before being struck like in that Agatha Christie one with the chocolates." "No poison," said Dr. Sumner, walking by at just the wrong moment. "He had a contusion the size of a duck's egg on his left temple. Likely blunt force trauma, most undignified." Behind the counter, Miss Twickenham's eyebrow rose by 1/2 millimeter. "And Miss Stone? What of her?" The speculation turned, immediately sharp-edged. "She said he was her husband," said Mrs. Hemming. "Was," emphasized Miss Clay. "That's the word she used, and not a single tear." "She's not the weeping type," added someone behind the magazines. "She lives alone," someone else murmured darkly, "with those red curtains shut day and night." The conversation took on the quality of courtroom debate, in which everyone present was simultaneously a witness, judge, and jury. But if the village wagging tongues formed the public theater, Miss Marple's parlor was the quiet backstage, where meaning collected itself quietly like dew on a spider's web. On Monday morning, she poured tea for Constable Finch, who had arrived red-faced and apologetic, clearly under instruction from Inspector Crail, who would be arriving from Much Norbury later that afternoon. "I know it's early to call," Finch said, fiddling with his cap, "but I thought, well, you being present and all, and the whole business being so peculiar." Miss Marple handed him a cup of Darjeeling and settled back in her chair with her usual gentle smile. "I do appreciate your thoughtfulness, Constable, though I dare say you won't need an old lady's impressions." "I think we do, Miss Marple," he replied earnestly. "People trust you, and you notice things others don't." Miss Marple gave a faint shrug. "Only because I've lived long enough to watch. People repeat themselves. Dear boy, most mischief isn't new, it's just wearing a different hat." Finch took a grateful sip. "Do you think Miss Stone did it?" he asked abruptly, and then blushed. "That's rather a bold question," she said with a twinkle. "Let me ask you this. What do we know about her?" "She moved to Elmswood 3 months ago, took Beecham Cottage, pays on time, keeps to herself, came from London, possibly Paris before that. No employment listed, but no shortage of funds. No shortage of suspicion either," Miss Marple murmured. Finch shifted. The man, Mr. Denham, had no identification on him. Just a railway ticket from Paddington and a torn bit of paper with her address. She identified him herself, said he was her estranged husband, but gave no detail. Crale's not pleased. Says she's holding back. Perhaps she is, miss, Marple said, setting down her teacup. Or perhaps she simply doesn't see why she should explain her life to strangers. That, too, is often misread as guilt. Constable Finch looked thoughtful. Do you think it's true? That he was her husband? Yes, she said it too easily for it to be a lie. A difficult truth often comes out with less ceremony than a pleasant falsehood. But why was he there? Now that is the question, Miss Marple said quietly, glancing out the window toward the direction of Beecham Cottage. And we mustn't be too hasty in assuming the answer. At the same moment, across the village, Vivian Stone sat at her kitchen table in Beecham Cottage, staring down at a chipped mug of untouched tea. The crimson curtains were drawn open for the first time in weeks. The small, neat kitchen black and white tiled floor, pale blue cupboards. One framed print of a sailing ship was tidy, impersonal. The air felt still, like something waiting to be filled. She hadn't slept. The police had been respectful, but firm. They had asked questions, taken her statement, searched her small sitting room, and asked more questions. And now everything was still. She touched the side of the mug, as if to remind herself it was real. The warmth of it surprised her. A knock at the door. She stiffened. Another knock, gentler this time. A woman's voice. Miss Stone? Vivian stood and walked slowly to the door. Through the window she saw a pale blue hat, a familiar one. She opened the door cautiously. Miss Marple, she said, her voice hoarse. I thought you might like some seed cake, the older woman said simply, holding a covered plate. Still warm, and sometimes the best way to remember one's still human is to eat something with nutmeg in it. Vivian hesitated, then stepped aside. Please come in. They sat together in the sitting room, where the light now streamed through the windows for the first time, casting patterns on the carpet. The crimson curtains were now pinned neatly back, revealing a view of the overgrown garden. Vivian took a bite of cake without speaking. Then another dot after a long pause. She said, He wasn't meant to find me. Miss Marple did not reply immediately. She waited. Vivian took a slow breath. We separated 2 years ago. Officially, I mean, he was complicated, ambitious, controlling, not cruel, not quite. But there were things I couldn't live with anymore. He didn't believe in endings, only interruptions. Was he violent? Vivian considered, not with fists, but with words, with silence, with financial ruin and legal threats. The divorce was final, but I moved, quietly. No friends knew where I went. Miss Marple nodded. Double quotes, he found me, Vivian said, her voice small. I don't know how. A few nights ago I heard footsteps outside. Someone had left a note through the door. No name. Just you owe me. Did you see him? Vivian shook her head. Not until yesterday I saw him, standing beyond the hedge during the poetry reading. Then the cup fell. I ran. I shouldn't have. Miss Marple's eyes were kind. People run for many reasons, Miss Stone. Guilt is only one of them. Vivian looked at her. Do you believe me? I believe you're frightened, Miss Marple said gently, which doesn't mean you're innocent. But it doesn't make you guilty either. Vivian closed her eyes. You must be very tired. Miss Marple said after a pause. "You've nothing to prove to anyone right now, but I would suggest something." Vivian looked up. "Don't hide," Miss Marple said. "You've done enough of that." The older woman rose, smoothing her skirt. "I'll see myself out. But if you find another note or memory that troubles you, do send for me." Vivian's reply was barely a whisper. "Thank you." Miss Marple gave a slight nod and stepped out into the sun dot as she closed the gate behind her. Her eyes flicked once more to the crimson curtains, now lit from behind by warm afternoon light. Curtain drawn can mean many things, dot. So can one opened dot, section 3. T. Threads and Quiet Theories Inspector Harold Crail arrived in Elmswood just before midday on Tuesday, wearing a herringbone coat, too, heavy for the warm weather, and a sour expression that suggested he'd much rather be back in Much Norbury dealing with tax fraud or missing bicycles. He disembarked from the police motor car with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm and a wool hat that seemed intent on escaping with every gust of breeze. A tall man with a gray mustache and a permanently pinched brow. Crail had a reputation for efficiency, though not for subtlety. "I'd like to get to the heart of it before supper," he told Constable Finch as they walked up the path toward Beecham Cottage. Finch, young and earnest, nodded along nervously. "Of course, sir. She's expecting us." "Miss Stone, I mean." "She's been composed." Crail gave a dismissive grunt. Composed women are rarely innocent. They're just better at waiting to confess. They knocked, and Vivian Stone opened the door with that same poised restraint that had unsettled half the village. She wore a dark green blouse and no lipstick, and her eyes were hollow with exhaustion. "I assume you have questions, Inspector," she said, not waiting to be asked. "Indeed," Crail said as he stepped into the narrow hallway. "Let's begin with how long you knew the deceased and what reason he might have had to visit you." Vivian led them to the sitting room, where the scent of fresh tea still lingered from Miss Marple's earlier visit. The crimson curtains remained open. The light filtering through the glass softened the corners of the otherwise spare room. "I was married to Charles Denham for 5 years," she said as she sat on the edge of the armchair. "We separated 2 years ago and finalized the divorce last spring. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year." Crail scribbled a note. "Any contact at all? A letter? Once, about a year ago. He wanted to reconcile. I declined." "And? Yet he found you." She nodded, eyes cast downward. "I don't know how. Did you let him into your home on the day of the murder?" "No." Crail glanced at her. "Did you see him?" "Yes, briefly. He appeared during the poetry gathering. I saw him at the edge of the hedge, and then there was a crash. I didn't know what had happened until I followed the noise." Finch cleared his throat. "And the note you mentioned? The one left through the door?" Vivian hesitated, then rose and crossed to a small desk by the window. From a drawer she pulled out a folded slip of paper. No envelope. The handwriting was neat, masculine. "You owe me." Crail examined it without expression. "No signature. No fingerprints, I suppose?" "Not that I checked." Crail tucked the note into an evidence sleeve and stood. "You'll remain in the village, Miss Stone." "I have nowhere else to be," she said simply. As they left, Crail muttered to Finch, too calm, "I don't like it." Finch looked back toward the cottage, uncertain. That same afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual seat at the corner table of the Maplebrook tea-room lace-draped establishment operated by the ever-watchful Miss Charity Lowndes, who prided herself on two things, her scones, and her memory of who preferred jam and who preferred cream. Miss Marple, she greeted with a smile. Your usual? Please, Miss Marple said, unfolding a copy of the Telegraph but not reading it. Her eyes flicked over the room. The Maplebrook tea-room had become something of a neutral ground in the wake of the murder. Those two polite. The gossip in the street found comfort in a cup of Earl Grey and a bit of carefully worded speculation over china saucers. Today, seated 2 tables to the left were Dr. Sumner and Mrs. Edith Sumner, deep in whispered conversation. Behind them, Thomas Elridge, the young school teacher, sat hunched over a notebook with untouched tea cooling at his elbow dot, and at the far corner, seated stiffly near the window, was Agatha French herself, gloves off, lips pursed, a small notebook open beside her teacup dot. Miss Marple observed all of this with the trained indifference of someone who knew how to listen without being seen to listen. I never liked the look of that cottage, Edith Sumner was saying. Not quite. Softly enough, red curtains. What sort of woman draws red curtains and leaves them drawn? Vivian seemed perfectly civil to me, Dr. Sumner replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Charles Denham, though that's a name I haven't heard in years. I believe he was once in banking, London. Or gambling, Edith said, which is more or less the same these days. Meanwhile, Agatha French lifted her eyes and caught Miss Marple's gaze. A pause, then she beckoned with one gloved hand. Jane, dear, she said as Miss Marple rose and joined her. Do sit. I'm simply dying to hear what you make of it all. You always know. As notice the things no one else does, Miss Marple smiled. I notice what people reveal, often without realizing. Agatha leaned in, lowering her voice. I've been thinking about that teacup. The one that shattered near the body? Yes. Chinese porcelain. A family piece. I had one identical in my mother's cabinet when I was a girl. Rare, Miss Marple nodded. And not something one would carry in a coat pocket. Exactly, Agatha said, eyes narrowing. So what was it doing there? Miss Marple folded her hands. It could have been brought as a gesture, a gift, or a reminder. Or perhaps it wasn't brought at all but taken. You think she threw it at him? Agatha asked, eyes alight. I think, Miss Marple said mildly, that things fall, especially when tempers rise. But porcelain does not fall on its own. Agatha's face flushed with excitement. So you do think she's hiding something? Everyone is, Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. But the question is what and why. Late that evening, under a pink sky bruising into twilight, Miss Marple walked alone toward the vicarage for supper. As she passed the Beecham cottage, she slowed. The crimson curtains remained open, revealing a light within. A single lamp on a table cast elongated shadows on the far wall. No movement dot, but what caught Miss Marple's attention was something smaller. Just beside the front door, where the post usually landed, was a faint smudge of footprint, perhaps. Slightly muddy. Odd, given the dry weather. She bent slightly, inspecting it. The tread was narrow, the toe angled inward. A woman's shoe, perhaps, but not Vivian's. Miss Marple recalled the pair Vivian had worn when she first moved to the village Italian. Flat-soled, elegant dot. This footprint was more utilitarian. Her brow furrowed. A visitor? A sudden rustle behind the hedge made her straighten, but it was only a fox darting away into the woods. Still, the sensation lingered. As she continued toward the vicarage, Miss Marple let the pieces drift through her thoughts like threads of embroidery, yet unstitched. A stranger returns. A porcelain cup shatters. A woman stands composed beside her husband's corpse. A note with no name. A muddy print by a clean door and one curtain, crimson as a wound, no longer hiding anything at all. Section 4. The first suspect by the end of the week. Inspector Crail had fixed upon a suspect, and it was not Vivian Stone, much to the village's surprise, and in some quarters, deep disappointment. The focus of his attention turned instead to Thomas Elridge, the nervous young schoolmaster who had recited Keats with trembling hands on the day of the poetry gathering. Too eager by half, Crail was heard muttering to Constable Finch as they stood outside the schoolhouse gate. Men like that, nervous, overeducated, underemployed, they don't like being ignored. Finch said nothing, though his brow furrowed. The suspicion, Crail explained later to Mrs. French and anyone else who would listen, was based on several observations. First, Elridge had been seen by Dr. Sinner loitering near Beecham Cottage on more than one occasion, often with a notebook in hand. Second, he had arrived early to the poetry afternoon, and when the body was discovered, he had been among the first to find it too conveniently placed, Crail noted, for someone who claimed to have merely followed the sound. Third, and perhaps most damning in Crail's eyes, was that Elridge had not once spoken to Vivian Stone in public, despite reportedly admiring her from afar. Infatuation turned sour, Crail said with a grim nod. It's always either money, passion, or both. Miss Marple, for her part, did not offer a public opinion. Instead, she invited Thomas Elridge to tea. The invitation, delivered via the school's caretaker, had caused young Elridge considerable panic. He arrived at St. Mary Mead Cottage at precisely 4 o'clock on Friday, dressed in a gray tweed suit slightly too large for him, and clutching a copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse, as though it might shield him from whatever questions lay ahead. Miss Marple greeted him warmly and ushered him to a chair beside the fire. "Mr. Elridge," she said, offering a cup and saucer, "I must tell you how moved I was by your Keats. So sensitive, so very ... He flushed. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I wasn't sure anyone noticed. I get terribly nervous in front of people." "Quite understandable," she said, pouring the tea. "Milk?" "Yes, please. Just a splash." They spoke for several minutes about literature, poetry, the new school syllabus, and the poor quality of the chalk supplied by the local council. Slowly, Elridge began to relax. Then Miss Marple leaned in just a little and asked, quite casually, "And how long have you known Miss Stone?" His teacup froze mid-air. I haven't," he stammered. "Not really. That is to say, I've seen her, naturally, about the village. But we've never been introduced." "But you've walked past her cottage." He nodded, eyes down. "It's on the way to the woods. I often go walking to clear my head, and sometimes I write, you see, and the bench near her garden is well shaded." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her tone mild. "And what sort of things do you write, Mr. Elridge?" He blushed again. "Poems. Only ... only small ones. Not for publication." "I'm sure they're lovely," she said. May I ask, did you see anything that day, during the poetry afternoon?" Elridge fidgeted with the edge of his book. "Only what the others saw. We heard the sound, something breaking, and then, well, we found the body. It was dreadful. I'll never forget it. Did you recognize Mr. Denham?" "No, I'd never seen him before." Miss Marple watched him closely. "Though," Elridge added suddenly, "I do remember something strange." She waited. When we got there, Dr. Sumner and Miss Stone was already behind the hedge. I thought she had been with us, but she must have gone ahead. "Alone?" He nodded. "Yes, no one else had followed yet." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "And did she say anything?" "Only, 'He was my husband,' just like that. Not a quiver." Miss Marple smiled softly. Some people carry their sorrows very quietly. Later that evening, she walked to Beecham Cottage again. Vivian Stone answered the door, still composed, though her eyes looked older somehow. "Miss Marple," she said. "Come in?" "Only for a moment," the older woman said, stepping into the hallway. "I had a question, if I may be bold." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Of course. That cup the one that broke near the hedge. Do you recognize it?" Vivian hesitated, then walked to a cupboard and pulled out a matching piece, blue and white Chinese porcelain, delicate and fine. "My set," she said. "A gift from Charles. Years ago. I noticed one missing the night before ... everything. I assumed I had misplaced it. Not the sort of thing he would have taken as a keepsake?" "No," she said softly. "More likely a weapon." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think he came here to threaten you?" Vivian met her gaze. "He always brought symbols, objects. When we argued, he once sent me a parcel of rose petals because he said I bruised things I touched." "And what did he mean by the cup?" Vivian's voice dropped to a whisper. "That I was fragile, replaceable, beautiful, but breakable." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inside something shifted. A new thread as she left the cottage, the evening air cooling around her. Miss Marple considered what had been revealed and what had not. The police saw motive in infatuation, in jealous obsession, but there was something more dangerous than romantic rage. There was control, long-standing, systemic, clever control, and Miss Marple had seen it before in other husbands, other marriages, other stories whispered over bridge tables and behind church pews, and now, perhaps, again. The next morning, the entire village seemed to buzz with the notion that young Thomas Elridge was about to be arrested. Mrs. French, resplendent in a new hat, declared it at the baker's. Edith Sumner confirmed it at the grocer's, and Miss Beryl Twickenham had it on reliable authority that Crail had already drafted the charges. But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She visited the vicarage and borrowed a copy of the church's annual fundraising report. She reread the poetry afternoon invitation list. She looked through her old scrapbook from the parish fair, where Vivian's name had been listed as a donor to the Widow's Fund. Not anonymous. A woman who donated discreetly. A man who arrived uninvited. A cup missing before the day began, and a footprint still lingering outside the door. Section 5. A hidden clue the following morning, as the autumn sun filtered hazily through Elmswood's tall chestnut trees. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, rereading her own notes, her handwriting small, tidy, and unhurried charted the players of the unfolding tragedy. Vivian Stone, poised. Private, recently widowed, twice. Charles Denham, dead man, former husband. Unwelcome visitor. Thomas Elridge, awkward schoolmaster, under suspicion. Inspector Crail, far too confident in his first theory. A porcelain teacup, once whole, now shattered. A footprint in dry weather, out of place. And therefore important. Miss Marple tapped the edge of her notepad. Something still didn't fit. The teacup bothered her. Its presence seemed almost theatrical. Why bring a teacup to confront someone? Unless the teacup was meant not just to provoke, but to symbolize. She thought again of Vivian's explanation, that Charles used gifts, symbols, tokens to unsettle and manipulate. That would mean he planned the confrontation, which meant someone else might have planned something else. Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by the gentle knock of Letty Sharp, the vicar's young maid who arrived weekly to help with housework. "I've brought your washing in, miss," she said, setting the laundry basket neatly in the corner. "Thank you, Letty," Miss Marple said warmly. "You're always so careful." Letty smiled shyly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "Mom always said if you do a thing, do it properly." As she turned to leave, Miss Marple asked, "Letty, dear, may I ask, were you at the poetry reading last Sunday?" "Oh, yes, miss. Helped Miss Lowndes with the folding chairs and the jam tarts." "And did you notice anyone unusual? Anyone who didn't belong?" Letty paused. "Not at first, but now that you ask. She hesitated. "Go on." "Well, just before it all happened, the shouting and the cup smashing, I saw someone walking behind the hedge near the back. Not Miss Stone. A lady? A lady? A lady?" Miss Marple's tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp. Letty nodded. "Brown coat, big buttons, blonde hair, tied up like they do in the magazines. She was moving quickly, like she didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And did you recognize her?" "No, miss, not one of the usuals. She wasn't at the reading proper. She came from the far side, near the little gate behind the cottage." "Thank you, Letty. That's most helpful." As the girl left, Miss Marple stood and crossed to her window. A second woman, a possible third presence. The broken cup, the muddy footprint, the hurried retreat. She reached for her walking shawl. An hour later, Miss Marple stood at the back of Beecham Cottage, where the hedge bowed slightly from the recent disturbance. She crouched slowly, knees protesting, and examined the path more closely. The faint indentation of a second footprint, different from the first, could still be made out in the soft moss near the gate. This one was smaller, narrower. And next to it, barely visible in the morning light, a glimmer of silver thread snagged on a thorn. She retrieved it delicately and held it to the sun. It gleamed faintly, silk, perhaps, from a sleeve or scarf. "A lady in haste," Miss Marple murmured. She turned and slowly made her way down the footpath that wound behind the cottages, leading toward the woodland edge. There she stopped at a break in the hedgerow where old iron fencing marked the forgotten boundary of the orchard. It was here that Miss Marple spotted the cigarette stub crushed into the dirt, lipsticked, foreign-branded. She used a handkerchief to pick it up and tucked it into a paper pouch from her reticule. That afternoon, The Maplebrook tea room hummed as usual with gentle gossip and teaspoons tapping porcelain. Miss Marple took her usual seat, nodding politely at Mrs. Hemming, who was recounting how her cousin once caught measles from a Frenchman. Across the room sat Dr. Simner, engaged in a quiet conversation with Miss Charity Lones, the tea room's formidable proprietor. Simner's tone was low, but Miss Marple's hearing, sharpened by decades of bridge games and whispers, picked up fragments. Foreign cigarette, hers, Unless never smelt smoke on her before, the scarf too. Caught on the hedge, Miss Marple sipped her tea serenely. After a moment, Charity approached her. "Jane," she said, her voice more clipped than usual, "have you heard what that policeman's doing now? Asking about foreign women?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Foreign women?" Apparently someone spotted a blonde lady skulking about the hedge. Now Creole's pestering half the village about travelers and barmaids. I told him we haven't had a visitor since June, and she was Swedish and barely spoke a word of English. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet, trouble does have a way of speaking many languages. Charity snorted. "Well, if you ask me, he's barking up the wrong shrubbery. Still thinks poor Mr. Elridge had some romantic fit." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said quietly, "the least likely person is the one nearest the truth." Charity gave her a sharp look. "That mean you don't think he did it?" "I think young men are rarely as composed in guilt as they are in innocence." Charity's eyes narrowed. "So who's your suspect, then?" Miss Marple gave a small shrug. "Oh, I haven't the faintest idea. I'm just an old woman with an interest in human nature." Later that evening, as darkness folded over the village and windows began to glow amber, Miss Marple opened a small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were bundles of letters, pressed flowers, 2 pressed moths, and an old packet of photographs. She withdrew one and studied it. A young woman in a fur-lined coat, standing beside a motor car, her arm through that of a handsome man with slicked back hair. Vivian and Charles, labeled in faded ink. She had retrieved it earlier from the local archive, where Charity Lowndes had kept old copies of the village newsletter and church fundraisers. The photo had been clipped from a London Society column nearly. 6 years old now. Vivian looked elegant. But the woman in the background, nearly out of frame, caught Miss Marple's eye. Tall, blonde, watchful, the same silver-threaded scarf around her neck. It was always the people in the background, she thought. The ones who didn't speak. And perhaps one of them had finally found their voice. Section 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The following Sunday dawned sharp and cold, as if autumn had finally remembered its duties. The village of Elmswood sat under a ceiling of low gray cloud, and the lanes were quiet save for the occasional chime of distant church bells and the rattle of milk carts on cobbles. But within the cottages murmurs stirred. The murder had not faded from talk, but deepened, ripened like fruit left on the branch a little too long. Rumors had grown strange tendrils, whispers of old affairs, financial ruin, even foreign spies, though no one could say where that last idea had come from, possibly from Edith Simner's weekly novels. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned from morning service with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her expression as placid as ever. She had exchanged greetings with all the regulars, Dr. and Mrs. Simon, Reverend Ludlow, Miss French, and spoken briefly to Thomas Elridge, who now avoided her gaze. She made her way up the lane, not to her own home, but to Dr. Sumner's surgery, tucked behind a row of cypress trees near the post office. She rang once. After a moment, the doctor opened the door. He looked surprised to see her. "Miss Marple, all well?" "I believe so," she said cheerfully. "But I wonder if I might trouble you for a word. I've something of a medical nature to ask." He hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course, come in." The interior was a warm muddle of bookshelves, bottles, and that curious smell of old antiseptic and pipe smoke. Dr. Sumner led her into his study and gestured for her to sit. "I don't wish to take your time," she began, settling primly. "Only I had a question about the post-mortem. Charles Denham, there was no sign of illness or overdose?" Sumner raised an eyebrow. "None reported. Cause of death was consistent with a sharp trauma to the head, possibly a fall or a blow, but there were no substances or poisons involved. No sign of alcohol?" He frowned slightly. "No, oddly enough, blood alcohol was near zero. Why do you ask?" "I had the impression from certain accounts," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Denham was the sort of man who rarely passed up a drink." Dr. Sumner leaned back. "That's what I was told, yes. So either he had turned over a new leaf, Miss Marple mused, or he wanted to keep his mind very clear. Sumner regarded her with narrowed eyes. "You think he was here for a reason?" "I think," she said gently, "he was not the only one." That afternoon, Vivian Stone found herself seated across from Agatha French, who had summoned her rather grandly by sending her gardener to the cottage with a note. Vivian had dressed with care. Navy wool, silver brooch. She looked regal and untouchable. Agatha, by contrast, had dispensed with social graces and gone straight for accusation. "I heard from Miss Lowndes that you received a note the night before Charles arrived," she said, peering down her sharp nose. Vivian took a sip of tea. "I did. From Charles? I believe so." "And you didn't inform the police?" "I gave it to Inspector Crail." Agatha sniffed. "Still, not telling your guests? You let us all mill about your lawn with a killer waiting in the hedge." Vivian said nothing. Agatha leaned forward. "You were afraid, weren't you? You thought he might do something. But you let the event go on." Vivian's voice was calm, almost too calm. "I wasn't afraid. I was resigned." "To what?" Vivian set her teacup down with a soft clink. "To the idea that men like Charles don't vanish. Not forever. They linger. In the corners. In your breath. In the rooms you never enter anymore. Even when they're gone, they haunt." Agatha, thrown off balance, faltered. "But still, Vivian, what would you have had me do?" she asked, lifting her eyes. "Raise the alarm? Cancel the reading? Have Charles arrested on what grounds hurting my feelings 5 years ago? His presence wasn't a crime. Not yet." Silence stretched between them. "I suppose," Agatha said tightly, "you always were better at suffering quietly." Vivian rose. "And you, Agatha, have always preferred loud condemnations." "We are what we are." Meanwhile, at the tea-room, Miss Marple was quietly receiving another visitor, one she had, in fact, requested. Constable Finch, still slightly green about the edges but eager to prove himself, sat across from her with an uncertain smile. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've no authority to speak on the case." "Oh, of course not," she said kindly. "This is purely curiosity. I wondered about that cigarette found near the hedge." "You sent it to be examined?" "We did. Came back with an unusual match Belgian brand, not sold locally. Lipstick. On the tip, as you said. And here's the curious bit, it wasn't smudged, fresh, which suggests it wasn't dropped days earlier." "No, ma'am. Has anyone in the village been known to smoke imported brands?" Finch shook his head. "Not that I know of. Only person with connections to the continent might be that Mrs. Galliard owns the antique shop. But she's been in Bath all week." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Constable. One last thing. Do you recall when Charles Denham arrived in Elmswood?" "Precisely?" Finch thought. "He was seen early that morning by the grocer. Asked for directions. No bags, no suitcase, just a jacket and a scarf. No luggage at all?" "None, ma'am. Odd, isn't it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Very." By evening the wind had picked up, rustling the hedges and tugging at loose shutters. Miss Marple sat by her fire, a shawl around her shoulders and her knitting basket. Untouched, the photo she had discovered lay beside her, now annotated. The blonde woman in the background of the image still stared off, half in frame, half out. It wasn't Vivian. It wasn't any known village resident. And yet, it had to be someone who had watched from the margins for a long time, someone who had reason not to want Charles Denham alive. Miss Marple stared into the flames, her thoughts knitting far faster than her needles ever could. Section 7. Another twist. It was the sort of Monday morning that whispered rain before it fell, the air gray and heavy, hedgerows curling slightly at their tips. In the post office queue, conversation was unusually subdued, with only the soft shuffle of shoes and the clink of coin purses disturbing the hush. The murder had become like a guest overstaying its welcome, constantly present, but now met with nervous glances rather than animated chatter. Miss Marple, however, felt a distinct tightening of the threads. By mid-morning, the shift arrived, not in the form of a new suspect, nor a dramatic confession, but something far quieter, and to Miss Marple, far more telling. A letter. It was Charity Lowndes, the ever-watchful proprietor of the tea-room, who brought the news to Miss Marple's table with a mixture of excitement and consternation. "I've just heard from Mabel Crick," she whispered, setting down the teapot as if it were a grenade. She saw the postmaster sorting an envelope for Vivian Stone, came in without a stamp, no return address, but local. "Recognized the handwriting," she says. Miss Marple's interest was immediate. And whose was it, did she think? Edith Simner's. Miss Marple blinked. Dr. Simner's wife? The very same. Well, Mabel says it looked like hers. She used to help in the Sunday school, always labeled the hymn books. Very distinct hand. A note to Vivian? Yes, delivered. This morning. No one knows what it said, of course. Miss Marple folded her hands. Well, that is curious. Curious indeed. Particularly since Miss Marple had noticed just the day before that Edith Simner had been rather quiet, almost brittle, during tea service. She'd picked at her biscuit and said very little, though her eyes had flicked often toward Vivian across the room. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the Simner residence under the pretext of returning a borrowed copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Dr. Simner was out, attending to a patient in the next village, But Edith received her at the door. Edith Sumner had always been a carefully put-together woman, but that afternoon her collar was askew and a tea towel hung forgotten over her shoulder. "Miss Marple," she said with a wan smile. "Come in." Inside, the house smelled faintly of polish and chrysanthemums. Edith ushered her into the parlor, where a half-knitted baby blanket lay abandoned on the arm of a chair. "Expecting a grandchild?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, dash no. A gift for the mission raffle," Edith said quickly, sitting down. "I always admire your needlework," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "You've such a steady hand." "That's not easy, you know, especially under strain." Edith's fingers twitched in her lap. "Strain? Well, the village has been under a great deal of it lately," Miss Marple continued smoothly. "And it must be unsettling to know someone has been killed just yards away from your home. Not to mention all the gossip." Edith said nothing, only stared down at the blanket. "I was especially curious," Miss Marple added softly, "about the note you sent to Miss Stone." At that, Edith froze. What?" The envelope was seen. Mabel Crick happened to mention it. "Of course. No one saw the contents, but I wonder, would you be willing to tell me what it said?" Edith's lips parted, then closed again. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might deny it. Then Edith stood up, walked to a sideboard, and withdrew a small stack of papers bound with twine. She pulled one free and handed it over. Miss Marple read silently. "Vivian, he was here before. 2 weeks ago, I saw him outside the cottage at dusk. I didn't say anything. I didn't think you'd want to be reminded of him. But now I wonder whether you should have been warned." "I'm sorry." -E. When Miss Marple looked up, Edith's face was pale. "I didn't want to be involved, but I couldn't bear the thought that she might have faced him alone and unprepared. I was foolish not to say something earlier." "You saw him before the reading?" "Yes. He was standing across the lane, just watching, like a shadow." "Did you tell your husband?" "No. Gerald always says I read too much into things, and perhaps I do." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Not this time, I think." Outside, the sky had darkened to pewter. Miss Marple walked back toward her own cottage with the note in her handbag and new questions crowding her thoughts. Charles Denham had arrived 2 weeks earlier unannounced, unacknowledged, and apparently undetected by the police. Why had he left and returned again? And why had Vivian not mentioned the first visit? When she reached her gate, she found a visitor waiting, Thomas Elridge, hat in hand. Coat slightly too large for his thin frame. "Miss Marple," he said nervously, I wondered if I might speak with you." "It's important." She led him inside and poured tea without a word. "I've remembered something," he said, voice low. "Something I didn't realize was odd until just now." "Yes? You remember the hedge near the cottage, where the teacup was found?" "Of course. I was there early before the reading began. I wanted a quiet moment. I saw Miss Stone coming out of the cottage, and someone was with her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "With her?" He nodded. "A woman, blonde, tall, wearing a green coat. They were speaking very quietly, but it seemed tense. I assumed it was a friend, but then she left through the back gate, quickly. And this was before the murder?" "Yes, before anyone else arrived." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. "You're quite sure of this?" "Certain." She exhaled slowly. So the mysterious blonde had been inside the cottage before the poetry event, speaking with Vivian. Miss Marple turned toward the fireplace, her expression unreadable. That night, thunder rolled in from the west, and Elmswood huddled under its blankets as rain began to spatter the windows. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat beside a flickering oil lamp, her notepad before her. She drew two names side by side. Vivian Stone, the blonde woman. Between them, she drew a dotted line. Then she drew a circle around Charles Denham, and a cross. Through it, whatever this was, it had not been spontaneous. Not a quarrel turned deadly. No, this had the shape of a plan, a confrontation, an ending long prepared for. And someone else, someone with a long memory and a deeper wound, had played their part in it. A shadow in the background. No longer content to be a footnote. Section 8. Miss Marple's final test. It was the kind of bright October morning that deceived the senses, sunlight glinting off windows, trees gilded in gold and amber, but a chill wind nipping at the skin if one lingered too long in the shade. Elmswood looked for a brief moment like a painting, timeless, tranquil dot, but Miss Marple knew better than to be deceived by appearances. After all, it was in this picture-perfect village that a man had been murdered, and a murderer still walked, free, possibly sipping tea behind lace curtains, or polishing silver in a parlor, or standing beside a rose bush as if the petals had never been stained by secrets. And so, that morning, she extended an invitation. Vivian Stone arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just before 11, her gloves folded neatly in one hand, her manner composed yet cautious. She wore a soft gray coat and a hat with a modest veil, though the wind tugged at it slightly as she stepped inside. "Miss Marple," she greeted. "You said you wished to speak with me?" "I did, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly, gesturing to the sitting room. "Just a little chat. Do sit down." Vivian lowered herself onto the chintz armchair and accepted the cup of tea Miss Marple poured without hesitation. "I understand," said Miss Marple gently, "that you received a note from Mrs. Sumner." Vivian's expression remained unchanged. "Yes, she told me Charles had been in the village before. It was unsettling. And yet you never mentioned it to the police." "No," Vivian admitted softly, "because I had no proof. It was just a glimpse Edith had caught. I wasn't sure it meant anything." Miss Marple took her own seat by the hearth. The fire popped quietly. "Charles Denham," she said, "was a man who left impressions. Some called him charming, others cruel. I wonder, what did you call him?" Vivian looked down at her tea. "Necessary," she said, after a long pause. "Necessary?" "Necessary. To endure. To survive. To outlast." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "He was your second husband?" Vivian smiled faintly. "My second mistake." There was silence between them for a moment, broken only by the clock ticking softly on the mantel dot. Then Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. "There was a woman, you know, seen near the hedge on the day of the poetry reading. Blonde, tall, wore a green coat or perhaps brown. No one knows her name." Vivian did not blink. "There were many people in the garden, but few unaccounted for. And someone else, Thomas Elridge, saw you speaking with her that morning." Now Vivian's gaze flickered. "He did?" "Yes. Before the guests arrived, you were seen with her. And yet you never mentioned it." Vivian's fingers tightened slightly on her teacup. "She asked me not to," she said quietly. "Who was she?" For a moment, the only sound was the wind scratching gently at the windows. "Her name is Lena Fawcett," Vivian said at last. "We knew each other years ago, in London. And she came to visit?" "She came to warn me," Vivian replied, her voice thin. Charles had written to her too. She didn't know we were still in contact, barely were, really, but he reached out to her with his usual ... venom. "She came here to make sure I was safe. Did she know what might happen?" "No," Vivian said, "and neither did I." Miss Marple nodded gently, but in truth, something about the response unsettled her. Vivian's face held no fear, no sorrow, only a strange resolve. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Maplebrook tea room. It was quieter than usual only. Dr. Sentner sat in the corner with a medical journal, and Miss French was laboring over a crossword puzzle. Behind the counter, Charity Lowndes dusted a silver cake stand. Miss Marple approached her quietly. "I wonder, Charity," she said, "do you happen to recall the spring fundraiser? The one where we raffled off the woolen shawl?" "Of course," Charity said briskly. "April, wasn't it? Do you? Remember the blonde woman who donated the silk scarves? The ones with the silver thread?" Charity raised an eyebrow. "You mean Lena Fawcett? So you do know her?" "Of course I do. She and Vivian were inseparable years ago. She's been in and out of Elmswood more than a few times. Came for the flower show 2 summers back. Strange woman, always watching, never saying much." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Would you say she was protective of Vivian?" "Fiercely. The kind of friend who sees themselves as a guardian. Always around when Vivian was in trouble. Wouldn't surprise me if she still writes her letters." Miss Marple filed the thought away. The next step in Miss Marple's subtle test came the following morning. She requested a small favor from Constable Finch, who, with a nervous gulp, agreed to help. That afternoon, an envelope was delivered to Vivian Stone's cottage, hand-addressed and marked "Urgent." Inside it was nothing more than a blank sheet of paper, but Miss Marple watched carefully from her garden as the maid handed it over. Vivian opened it at the threshold. Her expression did not flicker, but she stood very still for several seconds. Then she folded the note, walked calmly back inside, and closed the door. That evening, Lena Fawcett appeared. She had not been seen in days not since the brief mention by Thomas Elridge. But now she stepped into the light outside Vivian's cottage, her green coat fastened high at the collar, her expression tight. She knocked once and was admitted immediately. Miss Marple, seated by her upstairs window with a view of the lane, made careful note of the timing. Lena remained inside for 27 minutes. When she emerged, her face was pale. She walked quickly, looking behind her once, then disappeared into the tree-lined path toward the outer village lanes. Miss Marple sat that night with her notebook open, lines drawn between names and events. Vivian lied about seeing Charles only once. Lena had been present, before and after. The murder. The cigarette stub bore lipstick and a foreign brand. The silver thread in the hedge matched the scarves. Lena had once donated. Vivian showed no surprise when presented with the blank envelope, but summoned Lena within the hour. It was no longer a matter of who struck the blow. It was why. And Miss Marple, with a quiet certainty, now understood the answer. But the time for revelations was not yet come. Tomorrow she would host a final tea, and the truth long buried would step forward. Polite and terrible. Section 9. The gathering before the Stormum's Wood was drowsy under a pewter sky the next afternoon, the kind of overcast quiet that hung like a held breath. The murder of Charles Denham, once the center of whispers and speculation, now lay like damp linen across the hearts of the villagers. No new arrest had been made, no official updates from the authorities. The unease had shifted less about fear, more about waiting, watching. Miss Marple, who had rarely left the periphery of the investigation yet always remained a part of it, was finally ready to step forward. That morning she sent 3 notes. One to Vivian Stone, worded gently. Dear Miss Stone, I wondered if you might join me for a little tea this afternoon. I've been puzzling over some details and hoped you might help clarify a few things. Nothing serious, of course, just my silly old mind trying to tidy things away. Yours affectionately, J. Marple. Another to Lena Fawcett, left at the inn where she had quietly taken a room the day before. Dear Miss Fawcett, as someone close to both the village and Miss Stone, I hoped you might spare a short visit this afternoon. I believe you may have some insight that could help bring comfort to many unsettled hearts. Warm regards, Jane Marple. And the last to Inspector Crail, written in her most unassuming script. Inspector, should you be passing by Maplebrook Lane at 4 o'clock today, I believe you may find something of interest. Nothing urgent, but perhaps illuminating. Miss J. Marple. At precisely 3:30, Miss Marple prepared her sitting room with understated care. A plate of currant scones warmed in the hearth oven, 2 pots of tea, 1 Earl Grey, 1 Darjeeling steamed gently beneath, embroidered cozies. A cloth-covered sideboard bore tiny cucumber sandwiches, and her best porcelain service, pale blue with forget-me-nots around the edges. But the true stage was set not by doilies or teacups, but by placement. Miss Marple arranged the armchairs, just so Vivian's beside the hearth where the firelight would warm her face. Lena's across from her with a modest view out the window, and Miss Marple's own seat equidistant between them. A subtle triangle, neither adversarial nor intimate, deliberately neutral. The purpose was not confrontation, but disclosure. The tea would not be an inquisition, but an atmosphere, a soft space in which truth might emerge without force. At 10 minutes to 4, Vivian arrived. She looked more drawn than before, but no less composed. You're very kind to invite me, she said, stepping inside. I suppose I've not been much for socializing. Miss Marple smiled. Even shadows must be warmed by light, my dear. Vivian glanced about, taking in the setup. Are we expecting anyone else? Just one more, said Miss Marple, but I hoped you'd allow me a few minutes first. You see, there are things I wonder about. Not accusations, mind you, merely ... curiosities. Vivian hesitated, then took her seat. I've lived long enough, Miss Marple began gently, to know that pain comes in many disguises. Some people carry it boldly, like a flag. Others wear it as armor. And some, like yourself, learn to fold it so neatly that no one sees the creases. Vivian looked into the fire. That's poetic, Miss Marple. But I assure you, I have nothing hidden. Oh, I don't doubt your composure. But perhaps that is the problem. You see, others saw Charles Denham as brash, even cruel. But I think he was clever enough to know exactly where to wound. Vivian didn't reply, But the corner of her mouth twitched. Miss Marple continued. A man like that doesn't just come to a poetry reading on a whim, especially not after a 5-year absence. He was always theatrical, Vivian murmured. That was his nature, indeed. But perhaps he came for a final act, not to charm but to destroy. Vivian flinched, almost imperceptibly. The doorbell rang, and Miss Marple excused herself. When she returned, Lena Fawcett stepped in behind. Her dot, she was tall and pale, wrapped in the same green coat Thomas Elridge had described. Her eyes flicked to Vivian. Just a second of hesitation, but then she smiled thinly and took the seat offered. "Thank you for coming," said Miss Marple, pouring tea. "I thought it might be helpful for us all to speak openly." Vivian stiffened. "Miss Marple, if this is about—" "Let her speak," Lena said suddenly. Quietly Miss Marple looked between them, her tone gentle. "You see, I believe the death of Charles Denham wasn't merely a crime of passion or rage. It was an endpoint, the culmination of something long in the making, something buried." Lena set down her teacup. "You've guessed, haven't you?" "I've observed," Miss Marple replied, "which is rather different than guessing. I've seen the way Vivian avoids your gaze, the way you defend her with every muscle in your body, and I've seen how both of you recoil at the mention of Charles, not with grief but with exhaustion, like women who finally laid down a burden." Vivian spoke then, voice brittle. "We didn't plan to kill him. You must believe that." "I do," Miss Marple said gently. Lena's hands trembled. "He ruined her reputation, her finances. He isolated her from everyone who might have helped. And when he left, he took not only her savings, but the book she'd written. He tried to publish it under his own name. That's why she started." "Again, here." Vivian nodded. "Lena helped me rebuild. Quietly. I didn't want sympathy, just peace." Miss Marple gave them space to speak, offering only a quiet nod now and again. "He wrote to her again a month ago," Lena continued, claiming. "He wanted to reconcile, but he didn't mean it. He said he'd tell the truth, that she wasn't the author, that she was a fraud. He wanted to ruin her again." Vivian's voice was almost a whisper. "He said no one would believe me, that the village would turn on me, that I'd be laughed out of Elmswood. And so you invited him?" Miss Marple asked. "No," said Lena. "He was already coming. She thought if she could get him alone, talk to him, reason with him, perhaps he'd back down. But he didn't." "No," said Vivian. "He threatened me again. In the garden, just before the guests arrived. I told him to leave." He laughed. Miss Marple glanced at Lena. "And what did you do?" Lena looked away. "I followed him. After the event, he went behind the hedge to smoke. Said he was waiting for Vivian. I begged him to leave. He grabbed my wrist." She closed her eyes. "I pushed him. There was a long silence. He staggered," she said, "tripped on a root, fell, hit his head." "And you didn't call for help?" Lena's voice broke. "I checked. He wasn't breathing." Vivian reached out and took her hand. "I didn't mean to," Lena whispered, "but I didn't regret it either." The room fell silent again, save for the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple, ever calm, poured fresh tea. "It's curious," she said, gently, "how easily some men die, and how long their shadows linger." There was a knock at the door. Miss Marple rose. Inspector Crail stepped inside, his hat in hand. His eyes swept the room, taking in the stillness, the women, the untouched scones. "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, "that the truth has just been served." Section 10. The unveiling and the quiet that follows Constable Finch arrived 5 minutes after Inspector Crail, red-faced and anxious as though he had expected to be wrestling a fugitive, and was now unsure what to do with his hands. Miss Marple, ever gracious, gestured him to a corner chair with the calm of a seasoned hostess. She then offered the inspector a seat as well, which he accepted warily, his eyes never leaving the two women who sat across from him, side by side, one pale and brittle, the other unreadably calm. Lena Fawcett had not said a word since her quiet confession. Vivian Stone, hands folded in her lap, stared into the fire, her expression blank, though her body sat unnaturally still, like a statue waiting for the sculptor's final touch. Miss Marple took a sip of her now cooling Darjeeling. Before she began, "Before you ask?" "Inspector," she said with a polite nod, "no, there is no formal weapon, no smoking gun or stained knife. But I believe the truth, as it so often does, lies not in bloodstains or fingerprints, but in character." Crail's jaw set, but he said nothing. "From the moment Charles Denham stepped foot into this village," Miss Marple continued, "he did so with intention. He was not here to reconcile or even to reconnect. He was here to destroy Vivian Stone's carefully rebuilt life." The inspector glanced toward Vivian, who flinched slightly but offered no denial. "The published book," Miss Marple said gently, "the acclaim, the quiet respect she'd earned here, it all stood in contrast to the man who had once made her feel so small. He could not allow her to exist independent of him. When his threats failed to scare her, he came himself, believing he could make her retreat by sheer force of presence." "Sounds like motive," Crail muttered, "but not a confession." "No," said Miss Marple mildly, "but we must look at behavior. Mr. Denham was seen at the back of the garden after the poetry event waiting, it seems for something or someone. When he died, no one heard a struggle, no cries, only the quiet rustling of leaves. And yet, the fall that killed him could not have been accidental. He tripped, yes, but he was pushed. That much was clear from the scuff marks found on the roots. Someone startled him or challenged him, and in the brief, violent reaction he lost his footing." Miss Marple turned her gaze to Lena. "A woman of Lena's height and strength could have delivered that push without even intending to cause harm. And I do believe she did not mean to. But more importantly, she was there because she always had been, not just on that day, but across years, quietly watching, supporting, protecting." Lena's voice was hoarse. "I didn't mean to kill him." "I believe you," Miss Marple said. "What strikes me most is how carefully you both avoided drawing attention to his prior visit 2 weeks before his death. Mrs. Sumner saw him then lurking near the garden. It was no passing visit. He was measuring, calculating." Crail leaned forward. "So you think the plan to confront him came after that first sighting?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that Vivian hoped to reason with him. I think Lena, sensing the danger, positioned herself nearby as a silent guardian. But when Charles mocked or threatened her again, as he did so easily, Lena reacted, emotionally, defensively. And in that moment his arrogance met its end. A silence settled like snow. Constable Finch fidgeted with his pen. Vivian looked up. "It wasn't premeditated," she said at last. "We didn't lure him here to kill him. I swear it." "No," said Miss Marple. "But neither did you go to the police after. You let the mystery fester. And though I understand your silence, I cannot excuse it." Lena's voice came low and steady. "We didn't think anyone would believe us. Not after the things he'd said. Not with Vivian's past. We thought perhaps it was better left unsaid." Miss Marple sighed softly. "There is no better in murder. Only truth, however bitter." Crail cleared his throat. "This still requires formal statements." "Of course," Vivian whispered. "But I have discretion," he added, less gruffly than usual. "Given the lack of intent, and if the coroner agrees, perhaps manslaughter, perhaps even no charges if the evidence remains circumstantial." Miss Marple gave him a rare, approving nod. "Justice," she said softly, "comes in many coats, some lined with judgment, others with mercy." The following week the village began, very tentatively, to breathe again. The poetry readings resumed smaller, more subdued. The Maplebrook Tea Room reopened with a new menu of seed cakes and rosehip jam. Conversations returned to harvest plans and Michaelmas services, though the topic of Charles Denham lingered like the scent of strong cologne. Lena Fawcett left Elmswood quietly, boarding the 10:17 train with a single suitcase and no backward glance. Vivian remained. Her role in Denham's death had not been publicly exposed. Inspector Crail, ever pragmatic, had judged the fall accidental and the evidence too thin for formal proceedings. The inquest ruled it a death by misadventure, and the village, perhaps relieved not to endure scandal, accepted the conclusion with polite silence. Yet Miss Marple noticed the subtle changes. Vivian no longer sat at the head of gatherings. She no longer lingered in conversation, and the curtains at her cottage, once a deep, theatrical crimson, had been replaced with a soft cream. "Fewer shadows," Miss Marple murmured, passing by one morning on her walk. A week later, Miss Marple sat with Reverend Allerton over tea and barley cake. "You don't believe in coincidences, do you?" he asked, folding his hands. "Not really," Miss Marple replied. "Not in villages. Coincidences are for cities. In villages, everything is connected. People, memories, mistakes, they're all wrapped up together like a badly kept drawer." "I must admit," said the Reverend, "I still don't quite understand how you knew it was Lena." "It was very simple," said Miss Marple. "Vivian, you see, was too controlled, even under pressure. She had the bearing of someone shielding another. And Thomas Elridge saw her speaking to the woman in green before the murder, but she never acknowledged that conversation. So, people lie most when protecting someone they love. And Lena's sudden reappearance, followed by her unexplained departure after the false letter I arranged well, that told me everything I needed." "You tricked her." "I observed her," Miss Marple corrected gently. "It is quite a different thing." He smiled. "And now?" "Now," she said, "we wait for time to do its work. The dead are quiet, but the living still suffer. I only hope they find peace." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window as dusk fell. She watched the trees sway, their leaves trembling in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled 6. A cat crossed the lane. A dog barked once, then fell silent. Dot in her lap lay her knitting forgotten for the moment, because, though the matter had ended as quietly as it began, Miss Marple could still feel it, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. The truth had come, yes, but so had pain. And pain, like love or guilt, never left cleanly. Still, she smiled gently, because justice had come in its own quiet way. And that, she thought, would have to be enough. Section 11. A memory hung in lace. The first frost clung to the windowsills. Of elm's wood like a veil, thin and brittle. The hedgerows, once bustling with late autumn berries, now hung still beneath the silver air. As the village huddled deeper into coats and scarves, time seemed to slow, elongated by chill, silence, and the hush that always follows a scandal, half whispered, but never spoken aloud. Miss Marple sat in her parlor that morning, comfortably wrapped in a shawl the color of faded lavender. Her teacup rested on the windowsill beside a small stack of letters she had yet to open. Outside, the church bell chimed 10. She had already swept the hearth, polished the brass fender, and folded the Times crossword completed. Of course, before Vivian Stone arrived, the knock was light. Delicate Miss Marple opened the door herself, not trusting the latch to keep its proper angle in this damp weather. Vivian stood there in a dark green coat trimmed with fox fur. The color suited her far more than the faded grays she used to wear. A forest green, subtle, dignified, strong. Miss Marple, she said softly, I hope it's still all right. My dear, Miss Marple replied with a smile, it's more than all right. Come in. The tea is nearly ready, and I've baked a small seed cake. Nothing extravagant, just enough for conversation. Vivian entered with the slight hesitancy of someone unused to casual visits, though she warmed quickly in the parlor's soft glow. She removed her gloves slowly, her eyes flicking toward the hearth. Such a comforting place, she murmured. It smells like rosewood and dusted cinnamon. It smells like age, Miss Marple corrected gently. But I find comfort in that, too. They sat opposite one another, the small table between them, already set with bone china and polished spoons. A pot of Earl Grey sat steaming, flanked by a shallow plate of seed cake dusted with powdered sugar. For several minutes they simply sipped. No words. Only the quiet clink of china and the low rustle of fire. Finally, Vivian broke the silence. I wasn't sure if I should come, whether it would be expected or presumptuous. My dear, nothing is ever presumptuous when it comes from an honest heart, Miss Marple replied. Besides, I thought you might welcome the kind of conversation that doesn't require pretense. Vivian smiled faintly, though her fingers tensed around the teacup. Everyone in the village is terribly polite, she said. Almost aggressively so. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Politeness is our shield, but sometimes it becomes a wall, a way to avoid looking directly at pain. They don't know what to say. Most people never do. Vivian set her cup down gently. Lena wrote to me. Did she? She said she's found a position in a small publishing house in London. She reads manuscripts and offers editorial feedback. She likes it. Says the world there moves too fast for old. Guilt. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. She signs her letters with only her first initial now, as though even her name has grown too heavy. Guilt does that, said Miss Marple softly. It wraps itself around the spine, bends a person. Vivian looked toward the window, where the frost had begun to melt in tiny rivulets. I haven't written back yet. I don't know how to say what I feel. You needn't say anything, Miss Marple replied. Some letters are meant to be read, not answered. A silence settled, warmer than the last. Vivian leaned forward. There's something I never told the police. Something I never even told Lena. Miss Marple's fingers, steady as ever, moved to refill their teacups. The day Charles arrived, Vivian continued. He gave me something. A package wrapped in brown paper. Said it was for me. For closure. Miss Marple said nothing. Vivian reached into her handbag and pulled out a slim bundle still wrapped. I haven't opened it, she said. I don't want to. I'm afraid of what it contains. A letter? Photographs? Something twisted. Something to hurt me one last time. Why bring it here? Miss Marple asked gently. Because you seem to understand things. Not just facts or motives, but the silence between them. Miss Marple studied the package. Would you like me to open it? Vivian hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple took the brown paper and carefully peeled back the edges. Inside was a thin sheaf of typed pages, brittle at the corners. The top page read, An Unfinished Woman by Charles Denham. Vivian blanched. He wrote about me. Miss Marple read the first few lines in silence. Then she stopped, folded the paper gently, returned it to the wrappings. Yes, she said, but it isn't worth reading. Vivian stared. Why? Because it's not truly about you. It's about himself. A man trying to twist your survival into his own narrative, to cast himself as tragic, misunderstood, the kind of cowardice that wears the mask of depth. Tears sprang to Vivian's eyes. You've written your truth, Miss Marple said. He tried to rewrite it, but he failed, because you lived it and he merely observed it. Vivian pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple stood and walked to the hearth. She held the packet for a moment, then tossed it into the flames. Vivian didn't stop her. They watched as the paper curled, blackened, then disintegrated into soft ash. Later, when Vivian had left and the afternoon shadows grew long across the floorboards, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. She picked up her knitting, but her hands did not move. She was thinking not about the case or the village or even about Vivian. She was thinking of curtains. The crimson curtains, too. Be precise. There was something about them that had always troubled her. Not their garishness, but their familiarity. And then, days earlier, the memory had surfaced. A townhouse in Bloomsbury, years ago, where she'd once passed by on a visit to her niece. Crimson curtains had billowed in the top-floor window. The woman who lived there had later been reported. In the papers, a scandal involving a controlling husband vanished mysteriously during the war. The story had never been solved, but Miss Marple had remembered those curtains, and when she had seen them again at Vivian's cottage, it had struck her. They were the same dot, not in fabric, but in purpose. They were not decorative. They were a shield, a signal, not a warning to others, but a message to oneself. You survived him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In the end, this had never truly been about Charles Denham. His cruelty had been the spark, yes, but the fire burning long and slow had been about freedom, about the silent, hard-won victories of women who learned to stand without asking permission. Vivian would be all right. She was still standing. And the curtains, now cream-colored and soft, billowed gently behind her in Miss Marple's mind. Section 12. Lacework and legacy, the second Sunday of Advent arrived beneath a pale sea. Frost-bitten sky, streaked with pale blue and tinged with silver at the edges, one of those brittle winter mornings that felt as though it might shatter underfoot. Chimneys of elm's wood puffed contentedly, curling thin white smoke against the hush of a sleeping village. The hedgerows glistened with ice crystals, and every surface stone, branch, or gatepost gleamed under the glaze of dawn. Inside St. Mildred's Church, the scent of frankincense drifted through the nave. Wreaths of holly and ivy adorned the window-sills, and the flicker of candlelight pooled golden warmth in the cold air. Miss Marple, in her usual pew beside the eastern aisle, wore a dove-gray wool coat with a sprig of winter jasmine pinned just above her heart. Her gloves were folded neatly in her lap. The choir began softly, weaving a fragile thread of melody through the stillness. O come, Emmanuel." Miss Marple did not look at the Reverend as he began his sermon. Her eyes were instead drawn to the candle that had just been lit at the Advent wreath, one slender flame in the pale morning light. The candle of peace. It was called Yet. She knew that peace was rarely as simple as it seemed. Not the absence of sound. Not even the absence of violence. Real peace was something harder, one delicate as lace, and just as easy to tear. That afternoon, bundled in her thick knitted shawl, Miss Marple walked up the winding lane toward the churchyard. The frost had not yet melted, and her boots crunched softly over the ground as she passed the gate with its iron arch. There were no other visitors, only the crows that stood silently atop the old stone crosses, shifting now and then as the wind stirred their feathers. She passed rows of names carved into lichen-covered granite. Eliza Bright, beloved wife and mother. Major Lionel Penworth, Royal Engineers. Elizabeth Mercy Clutterbuck. Names that had once lived on parish lists and dinner invitations and rumor, but were now only echoes beneath stone dot at the far end of the yard, tucked against the shadowed wall beneath the oldest yews. She found the new grave. A simple wooden marker stood where the stone had yet to be placed. The ground was still unsettled, damp earth scattered over itself and crusted by frost. A small iron cross, rusted at the stem, had been loosely pressed into the soil. The inscription was minimal. C.D. No flowers. No sentiment. No forgiveness offered. No name even spoken aloud. Miss Marple stood still. The silence here was different. It wasn't peace. It was void. A lack of memory. The kind of forgetting that people chose deliberately. "I wonder who signed the paperwork," she said aloud. "Perhaps some board clerk in London. Perhaps no one at all." She studied the uneven soil, the brittle weeds at the edge. "There are people," she continued, "who leave nothing behind but fear, who wear down others until all that's left is silence." The wind stirred, and one of the crows flapped. Its wings once then settled again. But even they, she added, are still part of the story, whether we want them or not. She gave a small bow of the head, not reverence, but recognition, then turned and made her way slowly back down the hill. The village had already begun to rearrange itself. Not all at once, but in those subtle ways that life resumes after it has been interrupted. The windows of the Maplebrook tea-room glowed warm against the dusk, and inside people had begun to gather again over cups of spiced tea and cinnamon. Scones. Conversation returned, awkwardly at first, like a child learning to speak again. There was talk of a poetry evening to be hosted in the church hall, organized somewhat to everyone's surprise by Vivian Stone herself. Though she had declined all earlier invitations, this one she had proposed entirely on her own. Poetry heals, she'd said. It unravels the knots people tie themselves into. And indeed, it was said she had begun mentoring Beatrice. Cotterill, the bright-eyed girl from the parish school, whose fondness for rhyme had previously landed her in trouble with arithmetic. The girl had recently written a poem titled "The Lady Who Sang Without Sound a Piece" that brought the schoolmistress to discreet tears. I suppose she means Vivian. Miss Hartley had whispered in the greengrocer's queue. Of course she does, replied Mrs. Sims, not Unkindly. Miss Marple observed these changes without comment, but with interest. And then there was the cottage, the one with the crimson curtains. Or rather the one that no longer had crimson curtains at all. In their place now hung delicate lace shears, cream-colored, embroidered in a pattern of trailing vines. The windows no longer glared out onto the village green. Instead, they invited the gaze, offered glimpses of warm yellow lamplight, and stacks of books with bookmarks poking out like little tongues. One afternoon, Miss Marple passed by and noticed that Vivian's front door was slightly ajar, and laughter, a gong. Light, cautious, kind floated through the open window. Inside, Miss Marple glimpsed Beatrice Cotterill perched on the edge of a chair, reading a passage aloud from Jane Eyre. Vivian sat by the fire, knitting something pale and soft. Lace, Miss Marple murmured to herself, eyes warming. Not curtains, not armor, just lace. She moved on. A few days before Christmas, Constable Finch arrived on her doorstep, cheeks flushed from the wind and cap askew. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, ducking his head. "Sorry to intrude. Do you mind if I step in for a moment?" Bit of a chill in the air. She ushered him in with a smile, directing him toward the hearth and pouring a cup of tea already steeped. "Something on your mind, Constable?" "Well, yes," he admitted. "It's a small thing. Barely a detail, but I thought you might find it curious." She raised an eyebrow. "My cousin, you see, he works in municipal records in London. Civil stuff. Last week he wrote me, said he'd come across the name Charles Denham in a few errant files, hospital records, court archives, and some newspaper clippings from the 1940s. Miss Marple sipped. Apparently Charles had quite a reputation, controlling, possessive, the sort of man who liked to make women disappear into the wallpaper. There was even a piece, once an anonymous editorial, by a nurse who'd worked at a private facility. She spoke of a woman admitted for hysteria who had no family visit her for 3 years. The name wasn't listed, but the details matched. A timeline. It was ... disturbing. Miss Marple nodded. Some men do their damage without ever lifting a finger. Finch paused, shifting in his chair. Just seems odd, doesn't it, that a man like that could vanish for so long, then return, then vanish again. Miss Marple met his gaze. Not so odd if you understand how fear works. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Do you think Vivian was ever in danger? Even after ... all that? She was always in danger, Miss Marple said softly, even when she was smiling. Especially then. Finch exhaled. You're remarkable, Miss Marple. No, she replied gently. just observant. Pain has a pattern. So does recovery. On Christmas Eve, as the bells rang out over Elmswood and children caroled through the lanes, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, finishing the final stitches of a lace edging she'd been working on for weeks. It was an intricate pattern soft, ivory loops trailing into one another like winding paths. She'd made a single deliberate flaw in the design, a small skipped loop, hidden unless one knew where to look. A woman's life, she murmured aloud, is not measured by its perfection, but by how bravely it unravels, and how surely it's stitched back together. Outside, the night lay still and starlit. Inside, the lace grew longer beneath her fingers, thread by thread, in silence. Section 13. The thread beneath the pattern by. The second week of January, the soft hush of the holidays had given way to the brittle rhythm of midwinter. Elmswood Village, under its shawl of gray sky and bare-limbed trees, moved on with the slow confidence of a place that had seen many seasons, many secrets, and survived them all. Snow had melted from the rooftops and gathered in slushy heaps at the edges of lanes, leaving tracks of horse carts and boots pressed in wet clay. Robins hopped among the hedgerows, and chimney smoke curled upward in fine tendrils that blurred the air with wood smoke and warmth. The postman had resumed his regular rounds, the vicar had resumed his cautious sermons, and at the corner of the green, a quiet sense of balance returned to the casual observer. Elmswood seemed unchanged, but Miss Marple knew otherwise. She knew that in the spaces between gossip and greetings, in the shift of a glance or the shape of a paused conversation, the village had begun to adjust itself, not overtly, never obviously, but in the slow, unconscious way that living things do when a wound has closed, but left behind a tender scar. The most visible symbol of this quiet transformation stood at the far end of Rowan Lane Vivian Stone's cottage, once closed tight. Behind its velvet crimson curtains, now open to the world with lace sheers, hand-embroidered, and gently translucent. In the evening, the golden flicker of lamplight shone through, catching the delicate pattern of ivy and roses stitched into the fabric. It was no longer a house guarding secrets. It was a home becoming visible again. Inside the Maplebrook tea room, the atmosphere was equally changed. Where silence and speculation had once filled the air, now the clink of teacups and the soft murmur of neighbors had returned Mrs. Hartley. The widow baker, with a sharp tongue and a hidden fondness for nutmeg, sat near the window with her fiancé, Mr. Oswald Pike, the postmaster, discussing invitations for their spring wedding. Miss Pettigrew, the librarian with a taste for Scandinavian murder mysteries, read aloud from a poetry pamphlet she had discovered tucked into her returned book bin, and I quote, she said, adjusting her spectacles. She stepped through the hush of her own silence, and wore it like a shawl no longer needed. Mrs. Sims blinked. "Is that Tennyson?" "No," said Pettigrew. "That's Beatrice Cotterill." A moment of startled silence followed. "That little one from the school?" asked Mr. Pike. "Indeed. Published, too. Well, printed locally, with guidance. Mentored, I believe, by Miss Stone herself." There were surprised nods, small murmurs of approval. "She's a clever girl," someone said. "No wonder she's blossoming," added another, "surrounded by the right sort of encouragement." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her lemon tea and seed cake, said nothing. but her eyes, sharp and amused, glinted with satisfaction. At the greengrocer's. The next morning Miss Marple paused before a crate of winter pears. The air was brisk, nipping at her cheeks and fingertips, even through her wool gloves. You wouldn't believe the change in her, the grocer, Mr. Denton was saying to a customer ahead, smiling, making polite talk, asking after the Vickers. Mother, she's even been inquiring about taking on an apprentice, said something about baking, of all things. Well, said the customer, a matronly woman with a cherry-colored scarf. It's not as though she was ever rude. Just ... quiet. Too quiet, muttered Denton. The kind that makes you wonder what's behind the eyes. The woman shrugged. Everyone has their reasons. Miss Marple placed 2 pears gently into her basket. And perhaps, she said mildly, when people grow tired of wondering, they might try asking instead. Both turned to her in surprise, but she was already offering a warm smile and exact change, her departure marked only by the soft click of her walking stick on the stones. That afternoon, in the drawing-room of her neat, ivy-clad cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window and resumed her lacework. The piece had grown in length a table runner now, stitched with ivy tendrils and rose blossoms, their forms taking shape with patient precision. The threads were fine but strong, ivory against linen, and every loop seemed to hold a story. It was meant for Vivian, though she hadn't said so. A gift for the woman who had shed crimson armor for quiet intricacy. Miss Marple paused in her stitching when the mantel clock chimed 4. The light outside had faded to a violet gray, the trees, in silhouette against a cloud-streaked sky. Somewhere down the lane, children's laughter echoed briefly sharp and fleeting, like bird song, and vanished. She was not thinking about the murder now, nor the poison, nor even the delicate moment in which truth had settled into the parlor, like a final chord played on a piano. She was thinking about survival, not the kind that leaves one triumphant flag planted high on a mountain top, but the quieter kind, the kind that looks like opening your window again after years of stillness, the kind that leaves scars, yes, but also space. Vivian Stone had survived, and what's more, she had remained. In Elmswood, in her home, among the people who had once feared her silence and now respected her voice. The next day, Miss Marple received a visitor. Constable Finch, his nose pink from the wind and his boots damp with melted frost, appeared at her door holding a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully. "Brought this for you. Postmistress said it was delivered without a return address." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, accepting the parcel. Finch lingered, brushing a fleck of snow from his sleeve. "I hear Vivian Stone's hosting a poetry tea this weekend. Beatrice Cotterell's reading something special." "Yes," said Miss Marple, unwrapping the paper with gentle care. "She's calling it the lace that held the daylight. Rather a lovely phrase." The package contained a small volume hand-bound, with a pressed sprig of lavender tucked inside. On the cover, embossed in silver, were the initials VSFINCH peered at the title. "Is that hers?" "Her first," Miss Marple replied. "But I doubt it will be her last." Finch smiled, scratched his cheek, and said, "Funny, isn't it? How something as quiet as lace can hold more strength than all the locks and curtains in the world." Miss Marple met his eyes. "Not funny," she said gently, "just true." On Sunday afternoon, The tea was held in Vivian's parlor. The room smelled of lemon and pine, with fresh scones set neatly on mismatched china. Beatrice stood by the hearth, hands trembling slightly, before she began to read. The villagers sat in soft chairs and along the window seat, their postures attentive but relaxed. Outside, snow had begun to fall like flakes, spinning like ash. Against the gray, Vivian watched from the far corner, her eyes steady. When the reading ended, Miss Marple was the first to applaud. Not loudly, but with conviction. As the guests began to mingle again, Vivian crossed the room and placed a hand on Miss Marple's sleeve. "You came," she said, voice low, "of course." "I wasn't sure if—" "My dear," said Miss Marple, "you didn't need to be sure. You only needed to open the door." Vivian smiled, and this time it reached her eyes completely. "I have something for you," she said, stepping away. She returned with a carefully wrapped bundle of fine cloth. Inside was a lace bookmark, identical in pattern to the curtains that now framed her window's roses and ivy. Stitched with practiced care, Miss Marple ran a finger along the edge. "I recognized the stitch. I thought you might." They stood in silence for a moment, the warmth of the fire between them, and the snow continuing to fall beyond the glass. Later that night, back in her own sitting room, Miss Marple placed the lace bookmark into her copy of The Golden Bough and folded her hands. She did not need to reread the book. She had lived it outside. Elmswood slumbered peacefully. The cottage with crimson curtains was no longer a place of fear or memory. It was simply a cottage again, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the truest ending of all. Final section, the unraveling. The parlor of Vivian Stone's cottage was dimly lit by the soft glow of 2 oil lamps and the occasional crackle of firelight. Snow dusted the sills outside, and the lace curtains fluttered faintly as wind whispered down from the hilltop. The room was filled with a quiet tension, not dramatic, not sharp, but pregnant, like a breath held just before a confession. Seated in the corner, in her usual pastel cardigan, and with her hands folded neatly in her lap, was Miss Marple. She looked as she always did, innocuous, demure, like someone thinking about embroidery patterns or the best way to prepare quince jelly. But her eyes, those clear, pale eyes, were watching, and everyone else in the room knew it. Vivian Stone sat by the hearth, her frame composed but tight, like a violin string too finely tuned. Constable Finch stood near the sideboard, notepad in hand, but making no notes. And across from them, perched upright and polished like a museum artifact, was Mrs. Ursula Kent, the late Mr. Denham's distant cousin, and until recently presumed benefactor of his modest will. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I wonder," she said casually, "if any of you have ever watched a lacework piece being pulled apart, not by force, but by time. A single broken thread, invisible at first, but spreading slowly until the whole thing unravels." Mrs. Kent tilted her head. "I beg your pardon?" "It's how lies work, I've always thought," Miss Marple continued. "They begin so neatly, woven but one misplaced word, one reaction too quick or too slow, and the whole thing starts to fray." There was silence. Vivian's hands trembled slightly against the teacup she held, but she said nothing. Constable Finch cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, perhaps you'd clarify what you mean." "Certainly," she said, setting her cup down. "Let us begin at the beginning, with Charles Denham." He arrived in Elmswood under a different name, Charles Davies, but it was an old trick, one used by men like him who prefer shadows to scrutiny. He presented himself as a distant cousin and charming gentleman, but his presence coincided with a distinct change in Vivian's behavior: retreat, anxiety, isolation. Those who've lived long enough and watched people closely enough recognize the signs. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, then nodded once. I wondered, Miss Marple went on, why Mr. Denham had waited so long to reappear, and when he did, why he chose to do so not through direct confrontation, but through veiled social charm. She turned toward Vivian gently. He did not knock on your door first, did he? No. He inserted himself into the village, made himself likable to others so that your reaction would appear paranoid or even unkind. That's what men like him do. He threatened to claim the cottage, Vivian said softly. Said he had a letter of ownership from my late husband's estate. That if I contested it, he would bring up past grievances. Miss Marple nodded, but then, she continued, came his sudden death. A collapse over scones and strawberry preserve. A clean, quick end. Seemed natural at first glance until I remembered something about the jam. Mrs. Kent's hand twitched, barely perceptible. I'd been watching that jam jar. It had only been opened that morning, hadn't it, Mrs. Kent? Mrs. Kent blinked, composed. I believe so. Yes. And yet, when I examined it afterward merely out of curiosity, of course it was missing the telltale paper seal under the lid. An older-style jar, reused, but not resealed properly. Constable Finch leaned forward, suddenly alert. Are you suggesting the jam was ... tampered with? Oh, not the jam itself, said Miss Marple, waving a hand, but the inside rim of the jar, just a trace of residue there. A bitter almond smell, if one knew what to sniff for. Cyanide, Finch said grimly. Indeed. And quite clever. For if Charles Denham was the intended victim, as we now know he was, then someone ensured the poison would reach him by means most untraceable, his own gluttony. Mrs. Kent sat frozen. But how could anyone know he'd eat the jam? Finch asked. Others might have. Yes, said Miss Marple. But only Mr. Denham had the habit of eating jam straight from the spoon, even before the scones arrived. I noticed it when he first visited the tea-room. There was a pause, and then Mrs. Kent laughed a small, sharp sound. My word, she said, you really did watch everything. Miss Marple looked at her with quiet compassion. You knew who he was. You recognized him, didn't you? I did, Mrs. Kent said, long before anyone else. My sister was one of the women he destroyed. He lured her into a controlling marriage, convinced her she was unstable, and had her committed to a sanitarium. She died there. Never recovered? Her voice was steady now, cold, almost clinical. He left a trail of ruin, she said. And when I saw him again charming the village, manipulating Vivian, I knew it would begin again. So you killed him, Finch said. Mrs. Kent looked at him squarely. Yes. Why not come with the truth about him? Vivian asked, her voice quiet. Would it have mattered? Mrs. Kent asked. He was good at twisting stories. You know that better than anyone. Vivian lowered her eyes. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Then, at last, I understand your pain, Mrs. Kent. I truly do. But poison is a coward's method. Quiet, untraceable, without confrontation. just like Charles Denham himself. Mrs. Kent flinched. And in the end, Miss Marple continued, you gave him the power to die on his own terms, still in control of the room, still the center of attention. That landed hard. Even Mrs. Kent's shoulders drooped. Constable. Finch moved forward, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. I'm afraid I'll need a statement, Mrs. Kent. She didn't resist Dot as she was led from the parlor. Vivian sat in silence, the firelight casting her profile in soft shadow. Dot, after a long while, she said, I didn't want to hate her. And yet, I don't know what I feel. Miss Marple gently reached for her hand. Feel what you feel, my dear, she said. But never forget this. Surviving someone like him is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Justice. Well, justice is often untidy, but living well, that's where the victory lies. Vivian looked up, her eyes glassy but dry. Will it ever stop hurting? Miss Marple smiled, bittersweet. No, but it will change. Like lace under sunlight, still delicate, but different with every passing hour. Outside, the wind had softened, the snow had ceased, and the village of Elmsbois slept on its streets hushed, its hearths glowing, and its truths finally laid bare. Miss Marple left Vivian's cottage alone, her boots crunching lightly over frost-kissed stone. Behind her a window glowed gold. The crimson curtains were long gone, and lace, as always, had the final word.